Thanks for attending. Grateful for your time this afternoon. I hope you've been enjoying the other SFIA 9 launch events and you've learnt quite a lot from it. My name is Paul Waltuck. I'm the Chief Product Officer for WithYouWithMe, and today I'm going to be talking to you about managing the implementation and impact of AI with SFIA. A little bit more about me, Chief Product Officer, as I said. I'm responsible for commercializing the capabilities that we use in our social impact program. I'll talk to you more about what that sort of looks like as we go through. And look, I like many folk with WithYouWithMe, I am ex-military. I was a rifleman actually long before anyone thought about WithYouWithMe. But since then, I've been a software developer and a product leader, so about 25 years, with various different organizations, predominantly prop tech, stint at CargoWise, which is in the news for all the wrong reasons at the moment, and with them sometimes spent developing in Europe, sometimes spent working in North America, and a lot of time obviously here in Australia as well. But enough about me. Let's move on and start talking about today's talk. If at any point in time you do want to jump in and ask questions, please don't hesitate. Just use the raise hand, or alternatively, I'll just make sure I can see the chat. You can jump into the chat and put any questions there. On the call with me is Dylan from WithYouWithMe, Dylan Poulton, and Laura will be monitoring the chat and looking out for any questions. I'm totally happy with interruptions throughout this as well. I'd be quite happy if this turned into a discussion as opposed to kind of like a monologue from me. All right. So, as I said, we'll be talking about managing the implementation of AI with SFIA. This is not going to be a talk where we dig into the AI specifics that are present in the new version of SFIA. This is actually more about how skills frameworks, SFIA in particular, we think they are central and critical to the challenges that are going to be faced as we integrate AI more and more with our daily work. So throughout this, we'll talk to you about the way that we have learned to look at skills frameworks and the way that we think about using them in the real world. And hopefully from that, what you'll glean is some practical insights into how you can mitigate some of the challenges that will come about as we see the influence of AI more and more. There's a practical sort of step-by-step approach that we'll talk about, as well as some learnings on the human impact, but also at the end of it, I'll be able to share with you an evaluation form, which you can use when you start to think about solutions or systems that you might want to use for tackling the problems that we'll talk about today. So look, I will talk, if you don't mind, a little bit about WithYouWithMe, because it'll help to explain why we as an organization are actually interested in AI at all and its effects. Some of you may know us historically and probably think of us more as a labour hire organisation. The blurb on screen at the moment is very representative of what we do and how we think about ourselves, but I will talk to you about the history a little bit as well. Founded in 2017 by veterans who, on leaving the Australian Army, were quite shocked at how difficult it is to get their skills recognised in a commercial setting. Lots and lots of attempts to get work, able to actually get work, but not necessarily able to get work that used all of their skills. A really great story from that era. Our founder tried to get himself a role leading a security group at a bank, basically, and was told that because he lacked specific finance industry experience, he couldn't do that role, which is somewhat ironic. He'd led personal protection details in war zones. It's kind of like, really, are these skills not applicable? And what that is an example of extreme underemployment, a situation where you're capable of doing something, but you can't get those skills recognized, and therefore you are underemployed. Recognizing this, the team set out to essentially eradicate underemployment. That is WithYouWithMe's mission. To do this, we built an algorithm that we call Skill Potential. Skill Potential takes psychometrics, the big five, and aptitude, an aptitude test that we built ourselves, matches it through to the skill framework, the SFIA skill framework. And what it's measuring or predicting is something that we call skill affinity. So the likelihood that you are going to enjoy learning and practicing a particular skill. We use skill potential in one part of our business to identify individuals who have no other proof points of capability. And what we do with that is we identify people that we can upskill rapidly into entry-level roles. So we skill them up and we place them in a labour hire arrangement in entry-level roles with large and impressive organisations all over the world. They work for 12 months for us for those organisations, and then 94% of the time they transfer into those organisations as direct employees. So a very clear relationship between the idea of being underemployed, having no ability to prove that you could do a job, and then being trained to do those jobs. We do this, by the way, in fairly complex areas, so cybersecurity, data analysis, software development. So we know that skill potential works. We also know, because we run a free training program, we've had 25,000 people take on our training as well. Of those 25,000 people, the course completion rates are about 2.5 to 3 times higher than what you'd get in your standard MOOC. So your Coursera, your Pluralsight, your Udemy. So again, we're pretty confident that the algorithm is actually meaningful and works and is having an impact on underemployment. With that, though, we've spent quite a bit of time trying to understand where underemployment shows up and what impact it actually has. It has social impacts. Very obviously, not being able to get meaningful work is a problem. But on top of that, it also has commercial impacts as well. And so individuals who are in work, but not necessarily being recognised for everything that they could do, tend to be demotivated, are more likely to leave your organisation. So we knew that we needed to not just deal with that situation of entry-level roles. We knew that we needed to start thinking about the idea of how could we bring the skill potential algorithm to bear within organizations to help them uncover some of the hidden talent that they had and utilize people to the maximum that they could. On top of that, as we'll sort of discuss a little bit later in this presentation, we did a study with the Australian Army a few years back, and that was probably the first time that we started to get a hint of just how impactful AI was going to be. So much so that when we look at it, we tend to think of the idea, we don't think it's hyperbole to claim that AI is going to cause significant and perpetual underemployment for most thought workers everywhere in the world. Pretty dramatic, but not necessarily that outlandish. So what I'll do today is I'll talk you through how we think about these problems, how we would propose you think about finding solutions to them, and everything that we've learnt along the way in this journey of trying to build a solution to this problem ourselves. Okay, so just recapping, today I'm going to talk about something that we call skills lag. We hear about skills gap. We actually think it's a bit more of a systemic problem than a static skills gap that might be caused by poor education or sudden changes in technology. There's something more systemic to it. We'll talk you through how we think about that, and we'll talk about the concept of continual development as part of the solution to that. We'll then go on to talk about AI's disruption and what we see coming. Some of this you will have heard before because everybody is aware of the fact that it's quite impactful. But then we'll talk about the idea that continual mobility is a necessary part of how we address that in the future. Also along the way, we have come through our various interactions with subject matter experts, with roundtable groups, and direct study. We've come to see that there are a number of human challenges associated with AI implementation that also need to be overcome if you are going to take advantage of the technology and if you're going to keep your people on board and productive. We've distilled all of this into a relatively simple high-level strategy that we keep under the moniker of think big, start small, move fast, and I'll talk you through the steps of that. And then last but not least, I'll talk to you about a framework that we have built for evaluating continuum mobility tools or systems. And if you would like, you can contact me and we will be happy to share that with you. All right, that's what's coming. Let's get right into it. So, skills lag. Let's start with a concept that's somewhat close to my heart. the skills half-life. I actually first heard this term way back in the beginning of my career in the late 90s. And it's an interesting concept because it does speak to the challenges, or some of the challenges that we're seeing here, and starts to put them in perspective. But it's also quantifiable. Quite a bit of research has been done on the concept of a skills half-life. So what exactly are we talking about here? What we're talking about is it's related to the idea of a radioactive half-life, the idea that half of a radioactive isotope decays into another one over a certain period of time. So half of it becomes something else. Skills half-life is the same idea. Your skills decay over time. And the idea is, can we measure how long it takes for half of your skills to become obsolete? Now, research has been done, as you can see from the chart here. Back in the 1960s, it was probably like about a 25-year half-life for your skills. So in terms of a normal sort of 45-year career, you might have had to have upskilled once. That's been steadily declining since the 60s, and that is because of the introduction of technology and the rate of change that is implied by that technology through manufacturing. But as you can see, in the 2000s, it took a sharp increase. And that is because of the impact of digitization. So digitization, digital transformation, is the idea that your work practices are automated. As I think you'll all be fully aware of, this generally tends to relate to processes that are highly structured and therefore can be automated through normal algorithmic processes. That effect has been in place for the last sort of 20 to 25 years. And slowly but surely, the half-life of knowledge has been coming down. The half-life of your skills has been coming down. It's estimated now that probably the average half-life of skills knowledge is about 5 years. So every 5 years, half of what you know becomes obsolete, and it's time to learn something new, implying that you may have to upskill sort of 4 or 5 times in your working career. And in fact, we see this exposed in other areas as well. We talk about the idea that many people will have multiple careers these days. That is a consequence of that idea as well. But what does all this mean? So the skills half-life, the fact that it is coming down, is impacting the fact that we have a skills gap. But as I hope to show you just now, we think there's a little bit more to it. We generally tend to think of it more as a lag. So in order to explain the skills lag, the diagram that's in front of you here, the dots and dashes, represent all the skills that might be present in a particular domain at a particular point in time. I think of it in terms of software development because that's what I do. So we're talking about programming languages, we're talking about testing paradigms, we're talking about management paradigms, that sort of stuff. At the top of that curve, we have skills that are new, that are novel, coming out, emerging. And at the bottom of that curve, we have skills that are becoming obsolete and fading away. Everything in between is at a various stage of maturity. When people think about upskilling these days, we propose that the majority of people actually think in terms of what skills do I need to get my next job. Now, one of the challenges with that is that job descriptions are not necessarily particularly accurate in terms of the nature of the skills that are required. They only come out every now and then. And furthermore, you're probably not going to jump on an upskilling idea until you've seen it repeated a few times in a few job descriptions, until you're sure that the risk is worthwhile. So what we think is happening is that in this self-directed upskilling mode, people generally tend to take on skills that are towards the obsoleting end of the curve, perhaps not quite as dramatically as we're showing it in this diagram, but certainly tending away from the emerging skilts. Now, the question is, why are people doing that? And the answer really is because there is no other signal. Job descriptions are, job adverts are the best place you can go to understand what skills you might need, unless organizations are providing something else. So we propose that part of the solution is for organizations to ensure that they have clarity of understanding of the skills that are required for their organization to succeed. So this is the point at which we begin to introduce a skills framework like SFIA. In its simplest form, you'd all be familiar probably with the idea that, this is a case of going through role descriptions and mapping those over into skill frameworks. It's not quite that simple. You do need to then ask yourself, if the skills that are being displayed there are necessary and sufficient, our friends at Skills TX also point out that often job descriptions talk about peak requirements, when in actual fact what you need is somewhere in between that, and those peak requirements only come out every now and then. But one way or another, however you do it, the job of establishing clarity is critical, because what that then leads to is a situation where, for the people within your organization, you can actually clear away the noise associated with what should I learn next. You can give them a clear signal of what direction that they should go in. That's the clarity piece. With that clear signal in place, you can then start to look at what an individual's capabilities are. There are various different ways to assess capabilities. I'm not going to talk too much about our product. We use a sort of an individual contributor self-assessment coupled with a manager validation approach in order to help people feel like they're included in the process. But regardless of how you go about it, the question is, can you understand an individual's capabilities based on a skill framework? Having done that, you can then start to align those individuals with the requirements that the organization has, and you can then, of course, start to work towards closing those gaps. So we think of that process in three distinct stages: the clarity, the capability, and then the closure. So together, what these things do is they put you in a situation where you can get your teams ready for the roles that they currently have. But additional to that, we have started to experiment with the idea of asking ourselves, what should a team look like in 6 months' time? So going out to team leaders and saying, okay, fine, these are the roles that your people currently occupy. How would you like to incrementally improve those skills 6 months down the track? With that, what you're doing is you're conducting a kind of grassroots form of workforce planning. You're really getting to the coalface and asking people what they think is required. And that incremental uplift means that you can then use the same closure processes that we described before to drive people towards those outcomes. All of that can actually be aggregated up as well and interact with your top-down workforce planning as well. And it starts to help in situations where you're wondering whether or not the communication from the top actually made it to the bottom. Because if you have a situation where team leaders are describing skills that don't gel with the organizational objectives, you can start to ask yourself, well, did we get this right? Have people understood where we're going and what we're trying to do? The other thing you can do at this point in time is then start to ask questions about those specific skills and whether or not they are going to be future-proof. So you could use capabilities like Pearson's workforce planning division, their Fathom AI capability, where they can start to predict whether or not a skill will be around for much longer. If people are choosing skills that are obsolete, that questions the objectives and the business plan, and you can start to build a team that is more fit for the future. We call that process continual development. Every 6 months, we ask leaders to come in and think about what that uplift would be, and then we help them drive their people through that process. Continual development is critical for dealing with the skills lag problem. And if we think about that half-life of skills being very low, as I said, I first learned about this in the 90s because it's actually a phenomena that software developers have understood for decades. And what you actually do see is that software developers do tend to be those individuals who are prepared to continually develop and upskill at all times. What we do with this when we start thinking about AI is we acknowledge that it is possible from this point to start thinking about the idea of continual mobility. And I'll talk you through how we think about that. But first, let's ask the question about skills half-life. Is it possible that white-collar workers are going to be facing an 18-month skills half-life sometime within the next 10 years? As I said, it's a concept that I've known about since I was a younger developer. And at the time, the first time it was introduced to me, it was suggested that software developers, it is like an 18-month half-life. So could this happen for all white-collar workers? We took a look at some World Economic Forum data. They did a survey of 45 roles that were a nice broad cross-section of role types, ranging from roles where AI was going to have almost no impact, all the way through to roles where AI was going to have 100% impact. Across those 45 roles, 27% was the average level at which automation was going to happen. So 27% of the time in those roles was going to be fully automated away. Additional to that, 34% was going to be augmented. And in fact, if you take a look at the research that's out there, augmentation is apparently going to have a much bigger impact than automation. So important to understand that aspect, automation versus augmentation as well. The difference being automation is taking a capability away entirely, a skill or a capability away entirely. Augmentation is enhancing that capability with AI. No matter what way you look at it, you can do the math. All up, we're looking at 61% of time in role impacted by AI, according to the World Economic Forum. So is it possible that the 5-year skills half-life that we currently see is going to reduce to 18 months? It's our opinion that that's not an entirely unrealistic situation. And then harking back to that idea that software developers have been doing this for quite some time, the question that really needs to be asked is, are all white-collar workers the type of people that want to sit down in front of their laptop after dinner and, start thinking about how they are going to upskill themselves? Or is it going to become a requirement for organizations to take on that role and help people upskill? It's our belief that it will be a requirement. And at that point, we then need to start thinking about the concept of perpetual or continual talent mobility. So what does that look like? So look on screen right now, on the left-hand side is this is a demo user of ours called Sammy. Sammy has a bunch of skills for a role. This is a software development role. I do wish I had a marketing role or something to show you, but this is what we have at the moment. And what this is basically saying is, can Sammy move into this software development role that's here? A series of skills gained one way or another doing something. It's entirely plausible that it was in an adjacent role, DevOps or quality assurance or something along those lines, and then a need to obtain several other skills. Now, let's just imagine this was a situation where automation had taken away a chunk of Sammy's role, and as an organization, you are holding an individual whose a percentage of their salary is now not being utilized properly. The question is, what will you do about this? Interestingly, it does depend what labor market you're in. I imagine that in the US, where labor laws are significantly weaker than ours, consolidation will probably be the answer. Instead of thinking about, do I develop a person, if you're a large enough organization, you're going to fire one person who does a similar role, consolidate that job for another individual. In markets like our own, in Australia and New Zealand, and probably in the UK, I think the effort that's required to take that sort of action is going to be high enough to get people to a point where they actually consider the upskilling side of things. In other words, in order to develop the investment that you have made in an individual, you will have to think about mobility. So that's when the potential match idea, which is shown on the right-hand side, starts to become important. But what we're seeing here is we're seeing that Sammy needs to upskill to level 4 from level 3 in network design, software design, and programming and software development. We can see that network design, Sammy has an 80% affinity for that, so we probably don't need to stress too much about that skill. Sammy's not going to find that particularly hard to upskill. However, when we get down to programming and software development, we can see a 65% affinity, which implies that we will probably need to intervene and support in some way. Interestingly, this is where a key capability comes in. Oops, forgive me, I went the wrong way. There we go. So this information can actually be aggregated up to an aggregate level for a team, a department, an organization. And then it starts to become really interesting from the perspective of how do you apply your L&D budget. So what we're proposing is that having established that there is a gap, we can then start to think about the people who occupy that gap. Do we need them to upskill into this? Is it critical? If the answer is hopefully yes, then okay, what effort are we going to have to put into this? If we can see that there is an aggregated gap there's 5 individuals that need to learn project management in this case, for example, and those 5 individuals have low affinity for the skill, then we can say to ourselves, you know what, I'm actually going to specifically spend some of my L&D budget helping those 5 individuals to upskill. So in that way, we're taking our L&D budget, which is usually a mass effect sort of a situation where, we spread it thinly across a whole bunch of things, and we're actually starting to specifically apply it to places that we know risk exists. So it's one of the really important values that comes from having a skill framework perspective on your talent, capability, and requirements, but also layering over that idea of what does an individual's potential look like. That sort of brings in that element of risk reduction. So we call that precision upskilling, and we would recommend that it's actually coupled with a very comprehensive upskilling plan. As you go through SFIA, I think you would be aware that probably the lower levels of SFIA are it's sufficient to put people on online courses to get through that. But as you progress through those levels, the 70-20-10 concept comes into play more. So the 10% being that sort of formal learning, the 20% being mentoring, the 70% being experiential learning. You really need an ability to give people tasks in each of those areas. On screen just now, hopefully it's big enough for people to see, but on screen just now is Sammy's upskilling plan for network design, which includes all three of these elements. So what we're seeing here is we're seeing the organisation has actually spent a little bit of their L&D budget having an external person come in and be able to provide some mentoring sessions for Sammy. On top of that, we've used some of the people working within the organisation to help give Sammy some of the experience that's required. And last but not least, down the bottom there, we've got a link through to an external course that Sammy can take in order to also help upskill. So those things together, the idea of understanding what their potential is, understanding what that looks like from an aggregate perspective so that you can control your L&D spend, and then being able to actually help people upskill through a very comprehensive learning plan. We call that continual mobility. It's the way that you can then actually make those decisions. And what's interesting, I might just pop back quickly, this situation here where you have a skill gap, in the absence of potential, that is essentially an unmanageable risk for the organisation. You have no way of knowing, should I or should I not give Sammy a go at this role? And in actual fact, what happens today is that Sammy would be told to go away and figure out how to gain this experience, this upskilling by herself, and come back when she actually has the skills. Layering in potential allows organisations to actually take that risk themselves very carefully, understanding how they are going to manage it. So that's continual mobility. We propose that a continual mobility solution is critical to addressing the perpetual underemployment that we think is going to come about as AI intermediates white-collar work. But on top of that, you then need to understand the human challenges that you will have implementing AI. And this is something that we are fortunate to have had quite a bit of insight in. So I'll share some of that insight with you as we go through. So where have we garnered our insight from? We did a study with the Australian Army. I mentioned that at the beginning of the talk. We've conducted multiple global roundtables. We're fortunate enough to have Sally Walker in the UK run our European global roundtables. Sally Walker is the ex-head of the UK's offensive cyber capability, a stunning role, and she has a unique insight into technology. She has led a number of those roundtables for us, and what comes out of it is really quite interesting. We've done our own technical analysis as well. And I will talk a little bit about the recently released whole of government co-pilot study. I think that's probably quite meaningful to a number of people on the call. And then last but not least, we have worked with our own subject matter experts, and I'll give you some insights into their thinking as well. So the Australian Army study, I can talk qualitatively about this one, not quantitatively. But I think the most interesting thing we saw was that it was a surprisingly broad impact. You would expect AI, obviously, to affect digital roles. I think people are understanding now that it's going to affect a lot of white-collar work, but the effect actually ran through all the way to people who, you know, like I did, ran around with a big pack and a rifle. So very broad impact. Interestingly, there was an unbalanced impact on the roles that women occupied. Now, that could have been part of the way those roles were structured within the Australian Army, but we think that understanding that there might be diversity and social impact consequences is really important as you start to think about how you're going to implement your AI-based solutions. And then something else that was really interesting that emerged from that was the idea that it's important to include the people who are on the front line of using the tools in the process of figuring out how those tools are going to be used. I'll talk more about that when we talk about our proposed approach to implementing. The global roundtables, the key thing that came out was still that there is a strong sense of fear of AI. That idea of, will AI take my job is still an unanswered question for many people, despite the fact that, our research shows that it's more a question of it's going to take parts of your job, and people who use AI are going to take your job. However, still a strong motivating factor. Interestingly, shadow AI emerged as a challenge. So shadow IT is that idea that people within your organization are using tools like Google Docs or Jira because they're using the free version of it. And then when organizational admins take a look at the broader picture, they're like, oh, goodness me, we actually didn't realize it, but our company is using Google Docs. That's shadow IT. Shadow AI is obviously a very similar concept. The idea that people are using the Gen AI tools themselves in organizations, regardless of what that organization policy is. And of course, that then opens you up to significant risk. It opens you up to risk of information leak, and it opens you up to risk if those individuals haven't been trained properly. And we'll talk about what that looks like in a few minutes. Last but not least, organizations are generally tending to take, not government, I think government have actually, particularly in Australia, been quite proactive, but organizations, commercial organizations are tending to take a wait and see sort of approach. What do we know from technical analysis? When it comes to Gen AI, we think it's important to point out that it is inaccurate. It is an absolutely critical element that people must understand. And indeed, the Australian Whole of Government Co-Pilot also spoke about that. It's also important from an analysis perspective to understand that Gen AI cannot be predictive. We have this skill potential algorithm. What's interesting is that Gen AI cannot replace it because it can translate things, and that's essentially what it is. It's a large, complex, probabilistic translation tool, but it can't be predictive. So it's important as you're assessing products to make sure that it's not that the AI that they may be using is not Gen AI if they are claiming it is predictive. If you are going to build a predictive model, it requires a more traditional approach to machine learning, which requires a lot of data in the first place. And interestingly, that requires you to have a relationship that actually is legitimate and exists. What I mean by that is you can't, for example, yet predict stock market prices. That's because people simply do not understand all of the inputs necessary to build a model that maps from those inputs to stock prices. So it's important that people can prove that the tools, that the inputs that they are using actually lead to the outputs that their AI models are building. The Whole of Government Co-Pilot study, basically they saw that there was moderate uptake, which was interesting, and mostly senior roles. Again, I'm not sure what the reasons are, but one of the outcomes there. They found that tailored training did enhance people's confidence, and confidence is an important one in the use of it. They found that inaccuracy reduced the benefits. So again, there is that problem of not everything that comes out of a generative AI solution, an LLM, is accurate. And then they had legal, cultural, and governance concerns as well, which is interesting because this blends with the way that our subject matter experts look at this. So we've been fortunate to work with Paul Twomey, former CEO of ICANN, who has written an ethics course for us on AI ethics. And ethics is one of the key pieces that he talks about. It's important to understand what can go wrong as you're using a generative AI. It's also important that you have some critical thinking skills so that you understand when you are seeing your biases in action. One of the fascinating things about ChatGPT is that it's a total yes man. I don't know if you've noticed that or if it's just the way I query ChatGPT. I do not know, but it's always like, hey, this is the greatest idea ever. And then if you explicitly ask it to critique your idea further, that's when you start to get, oh, well, maybe it's not the greatest idea ever. It leans into that confirmation bias so heavily, it's not funny. So understanding critical thinking and the way we think is really quite important. Risk reduction. These two things together lead to risk reduction, and that is the key element. People are waiting to wait and see because they're not understanding the level of risk and they're not understanding how to control that risk. As you'll see as we go through our proposed implementation process, critical thinking and ethics are really important. Last but not least, our subject matter experts have helped us develop the idea of think big, start small, move fast. This is the way that you address all of the problems that are described, and it's essentially an agile practice. Noting that we are running out of time, I will jump into what that looks like. So what does a human-centric AI implementation process look like? We propose that you should focus initially on upskilling, and the upskilling should be around ethics and critical thinking. What you want to do is you want to get to a situation where you've reduced the risk of your individuals using these tools as much as possible, and then you can allow them to start to discover the use cases that really work for you. We absolutely propose that you should implement a continuous development, and mobility solution, so that you can manage the outcomes of situations where those brilliant use cases that your people are discovering do actually take work away from individuals, so that you can figure out how to reallocate those resources rapidly and to the best of their ability. It's important, as we discovered in the Army research, it's important to use the people who are on the front line. As I said, educate them and then get them to help you discover the use cases. The reason this is powerful is because it puts people in control of what's happening. So rather than being a victim of the circumstance, they are actually one of the stakeholders in that circumstance, and they become evangelists as well. It's important that your leadership team works to build trust. One of the most important things that sort of came out of our roundtables was the idea that leaders need to make sure that the message that you're not going to be replaced by AI, parts of your role are going to be replaced, parts of your work is going to be augmented. If you've already got a continual mobility solution in place, you're showing people that you are interested in their continued development and productivity and place within the organization. So leading in that sort of positive growth mindset is really important as well. And then last but not least, continually monitor the situation. You need to be constantly thinking about those use cases, what the impact of those use cases are, and making sure that people are moving in the right direction. Just checking time. I'm happy to share this with everyone, of course. We're coming up on time. I'll just quickly tell you about our evaluation framework for continual mobility solutions. If you reach out to me, I'd be happy to share it directly with you, but we will be making it available on our website shortly as well. But essentially, we talk through what you should be thinking about in terms of assessing whether you are achieving clarity, capability, closure, whether or not you have a solution that mitigates the risk of upskilling. And then we talk a little bit about what you should be thinking about when you are evaluating the AI componentry of some of the solutions that you'll be looking at. That actually brings us to the end of my giant monologue. Or maybe Dylan, Laura, is there anything in particular that you think I should address first?
Paul, there's just been some really great chat in there, just talking around AI. I think we've had some really good discussion between everyone about what's going to happen, how shadow AI and AI might affect things, and some of the positives that might come as well. So a really good discussion.
Does anyone have anything in particular they'd like me to talk about? Elias, you have a question?
Hello. Yeah, thank you. That was excellent. And you know, when people agree with you, you think they're geniuses. I think you must be really, really bright. But so we're finding something similar. We've got an internal program looking at AI, and there's an overestimate of its capabilities because it seems like magic.
Yes.
And you're kind of like, yeah, it's just math, and you know, it's like, relax. So there's something I'm interested, because you've done much more thorough research than we're doing. I'm interested in more around that, if you've got time, or if other people have interest, because that somewhat underpins what we're trying to do, I think.
So let me sort of restate that. There's the idea that people are overestimating what it can do, and it is the question around, you know, do we understand the level of that overestimation or the cause? Yeah. Is that kind of where you're getting at? I'm gonna have to admit that I don't have a researched answer on that one. I have what I've picked up as we've been looking at these things, and I completely agree. I think the challenge is that we're dealing with a capability that looks like it does stuff that until a few years ago, only people did. And consequently, whenever it sort of expresses that capability, people immediately assume that it is incredibly capable and, essentially intelligent. I even think AI is still a misnomer. We shouldn't be using artificial intelligence. We should still be talking about machine learning. I can give you an anecdotal example of this situation. Back in early 23, when ChatGPT 3 was released, people from within my organization started sending me examples of GPTs that could take job descriptions and match them into SFIA immediately. And everybody that sent me one, and there were about 4, everybody that sent me one was like, "Oh, it's 95% accurate. It's amazing. It's unreal." And sure enough, when you look at it first, you're like, "Oh yeah, that is amazing, I guess." But then when my data team took that, built out 100 examples of different job descriptions, built out exactly what you would expect, and then started to analyze them, not just in terms of what they got right, but in terms of what they got wrong, the accuracy percentage that actually came out was more like 20%. So I think you're correct, Elias. It's that sense of, oh, this thing can do stuff that people can do. It must be amazing. But the reality is it's doing a really bad job in many cases. And you need to build structures and capabilities around that control for that. So we have actually built something that can take a job description and give you a reasonable starting point for SFIA skills. But in order to do that, we had to build a multi-agent solution that broke the job descriptions down into different sections and then focused on those sections to pull out the skills, but then also cross-checked by taking a look at, could you interpret that section as belonging to a particular part of the SFIA framework? The way it's got the multiple categories. So there were multiple ways to cross-check in order to get to a place where we were reasonably confident that it was actually producing the right result. So yeah, does that sort of answer your question?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, it does.
There's a couple of questions here. I'll help.
Mm-hmm.
Kim had a question around the cost of continual mobility to the business. Do you have any thoughts or discussion around that?
It's interesting, right? Because so the cost of continual mobility, when you look at software developers, there's a fascinating use case here. Software developers, as I've said, have been aware of this idea for ages. So they are constantly doing exactly what I described. After dinner, you sit down with your GitHub repo and you go and build some solution that solves an abstract problem in a particular language just to prove that you can do it. You need that type of person in order to succeed as a software developer. What you see when you look at the tenure of software developers is that the average tenure of a software developer is 1 to 3 years compared to other white-collar knowledge workers, which is more like 4 to 5 years. What those individuals are doing is implementing their own continual mobility. So they learn these things and then they go, well, I'm not using it here. I'm going to go to another company. So fascinatingly, I totally understand the idea that, oh, there's a cost associated with this. And obviously we build software that helps to reduce that cost, but there is definitely a cost associated with this. The flip side of it is you are either going to be holding individuals that you're paying to do where a percentage of their capability is just not usable anymore. That's a cost in itself. Or the flip side is if they take care of this themselves, like if you push it into a realm where they take care of it so the organization doesn't have to, which is what happens with software developers, then you're going to start to see tenure problems because those people are going to move more frequently than they currently do. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. Hopefully that sort of answers the question.
Paul, there was another question here, sort of tackling the other side of things. So Michelle's asked, how will organizations manage the challenge of AI reducing entry-level jobs and thus the future highly skilled workforce can't replenish once those workers retire, stop working?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I will actually come back to that one. I wrote an article that ended up in the Sydney Morning Herald about it, although it wasn't particularly detailed. But sorry, Kim did ask the question, what about beyond software developers? I guess what I'm trying to say is that if AI intermediates more and more white-collar roles, the simple facts of the matter are that if they want to stay productive, they're going to have to learn. The question is, are we going to push that on those individuals, or are organizations going to pay to do it? And really, it's a catch-22, because if you don't pay to do it and those individuals don't decide to do it, then you're essentially holding a person who, a percentage of their skills and time is wasted. So yeah, it absolutely applies to people beyond software developers, and it's the same concept. It's a question of, we're going to have to tackle this problem. Otherwise, we're either holding wasted money, like we're wasting our money on people, or those people are doing it themselves and then they're leaving. So I don't know. It's plausible that we'll go with the second model where people upskill themselves and then just leave and go get another job. Or if we really want to keep retention where we need it, we'd need to think about spending the money ourselves. I do point back to that idea of precision upskilling, hopefully helping to reduce the overall cost and increase the overall effectiveness. Going back to the last question, if I understand correctly, we're talking about the idea that a lot of entry-level roles are being taken by solutions that use AI. Some of the big firms have categorically demonstrated that I think ChatGPT, for example, can do the job of an entry-level developer. So what do we do about that? It's a great question. Part of the traditional response to that would be to push it back on the education system and just say, I don't care. So it's going to take another 5 years of uni in order to get that person to the same level as a software developer who's been working for 3 years in a real job. Just go take care of that. I don't think that's going to be sustainable. So the question is, how do you work around that? I'm not 100% sure, but I would argue that we probably need to not be pushing our students away from using AI, which is what we're currently trying to do. And we probably need to start embracing it, but embracing it with that concept of understanding the ethics and the critical thinking associated with it, leveraging that critical thinking so that they are able to use the AI to progress themselves through the more basic work. In short, they need to become users of the ML-based, the AI-based solutions that do the work. They need to become the people that would assess the output of those entry-level, of those bots that are doing that entry-level work. That's my thinking, but it's not particularly well thought through.
Awesome. Paul, if I take you to sort of the end of the chat, past the excellent Homer Simpson, well, no, it's not Homer.
It's Abe.
It's Abe Simpson. Jacob actually asked a question. It was sort of similar around the thoughts around building learning into the flow of work. And I know this is something that you love, but the thoughts around gamification and incentivizing folks around their learning.
Yeah, the flow of work concept, I think, is ultimately critical. I actually haven't been able to do too much research into how you would make that work. I think an element of it, though, we did speak about the 70-20-10 learning plans, and I think that's part of it. It's being able to recognize the idea that not everything has to be go to a course and learn the course. Some things can be done by leveraging individuals within your organization. So encouraging people to step up and be mentors. So, for example, when you see someone reach a certain level of capability and you can tell through other sort of qualitative results, like for instance their big five, that they have an affinity, that they probably have an affinity for talking to other people and teaching other people, then you could start to leverage mentors. And so as for example in our paradigm that we're proposing, as team leaders sort of suggest, hey, here's an incremental lift, getting people from within the organization to involve those individuals perhaps in the work that they are actually doing over here as those individuals are learning to be more capable, that's an in the flow of work experiential sort of a situation. So I don't know that that's a whole answer, but I feel like that's part of the answer to how we achieve that outcome. Passion projects is interesting. Obviously I keep referring back to software developers, but one of the things that does happen with software developers to keep some of that development inside the organization is things called hack weeks, where people get to do passion projects. They get to hack anything they might like consider doing.
Lisa also made a great comment there around temporary opportunities, not just the first skills. I love that idea.
Yeah. So the idea of secondment, which I think in government is actually a more structured process, but I think it definitely needs to sort of exist within organizations. And interestingly, I wonder if there's a future in which organizations that want to work together can actually second people between orgs rather than having them go off and take a job somewhere else. It's like, actually, I've got an agreement with this organization. You're going to go for 6 months, do a job, and then come back to me type thing. I think we are over time. Happy to stay and answer any other questions, though, if there are any.
I'll just say it rather than typing it out. Just thanks for a really good presentation, and it's given me some really good thoughts on how to frame that conversation, but also just wanted to shout out a massive kudos to WithYouWithMe. I've done a lot of research on the education sector in Australia, and there's a lot of people out there providing training. There's very few organisations out there that are actually providing that work integrated learning, training that actually leads to job outcomes. So you're doing a great job. Keep it up.
Thank you. Really appreciate that. Thanks, Jacob. Hey, thanks everyone. Really appreciated your time today. Reach out to me. You follow the LinkedIn link. Reach out to me on LinkedIn. More than happy to connect and talk more about this.